So we're diving into culture mapping with this workshop series, getting a head start on understanding these big ideas, how to use them for analysis, and what they tell us about what's coming next.
Using something as, well, enduring as storytelling to make sense of where culture and innovation intersect, it's pretty fascinating.
This idea of narrative systems being so central to innovation. Can we dig into that a little more? What's the link?
Well, stories are how we make sense of things, gives us that structure, the why, and can even hint at what's ahead. Trends are similar. Culture mapping uses this to kind of get ahead of the curve.
So it's like instead of a book, we're reading culture, and if we get the narrative, we get a peek at future chapters.
Exactly. And to do that, it leans heavily on this idea of the hero's journey, that classic story structure you see everywhere.
Right, the hero, they hit a wall, go through some transformation, come out changed. It's everywhere. But how does that circle back to culture mapping specifically?
It uses that hero's journey to break down how trends develop, like plotting points on a story arc. And those points are called story spaces, and there are four main ones.
Okay, those four story spaces, let's break them down. What's the first one?
The first is the disruptive story space. It's where that existing status quo gets challenged. Think about your rebels, sages, magicians figures who question the norm and envision those alternatives.
I can see the connection to disruption there.
Yeah.
Any real-world examples of this in action, where it's playing out?
Think of things like the hacking as design movement, challenging those traditional design approaches, or even protest being used as design to expose flaws and force change. Even those rage manifestos we see online, pure disruptive story space energy.
You've got these disruptors shaking things up. Then what? Where does that second story space come in?
That's where the emergent story space comes in, where your explorers, creators, and jesters show up. They experiment, push those boundaries, rewrite the rules.
So if disruptive story space tears down the old, emergent story space builds up the new.
Exactly. A good example, fashion designer Virgil Abloh, he incorporated everyday objects into high fashion, playing with materials and even the whole definition of fashion itself. That's emergent story space thinking in action.
Okay, we've gone from disruption to experimentation. What's next?
Things start solidifying in what's called the dominant story space. This is where your heroes, lovers, and innocents step in, taking those new ideas and pushing them into the mainstream.
So they're like the early adopters, making the new stuff seem, well, desirable.
Exactly. The IKEA effect, we value the things we build ourselves, right? That shows the lover archetype in the dominant story space. It's about building ownership. Or think about those cult-like brand loyalties. The innocent archetype craving belonging and simplicity, all aspects of this space.
Yeah, that's when we see that new order kind of coming out of those initially kind of edgy ideas.
Which brings us to that final story space, right? The residual story space. Can you tell me more about that one? Think of it like the institutionalization phase, where you've got your caregivers, rulers, every man coming in, creating the systems and structures to support this whole new paradigm. Like, they're drawn to the space because it just clicks with their values. Caregivers want to nurture, rulers want order, and the everyman. They're looking for those solutions that work for everyone.
Like the difference between a grassroots thing and like a well-established institution, that revolution becomes the routine.
Exactly. It's about that stability, those standards to make sure these innovations stick around.
Okay, this is really starting to make sense. But how do the workshops actually work? Like, how can someone use this in their own work?
That's what's so cool about this approach, right? The exercises take these sort of abstract concepts and make them actionable.
Let's take each story space and kind of walk through the types of exercises we might see. Let's start back with the disruptive story space. What might we do in the workshop to, like, really get a handle on this space?
Let's say you're putting together a design manifesto for, I don't know, a more sustainable food system. The workshop might ask you to find those rebel codes, those big issues that need to be, disrupted. You'd pinpoint things like food waste, where our food's coming from, ethical sourcing, and access to healthier options.
So you're really homing in on the problems, those things that need to change. What comes after that?
You dig into what are called sage codes, those insights that can actually guide solutions. This could mean checking out existing movements, digging into the data, or even just talking to experts to wrap your head around the problem.
You're basically grounding that passion for change with actual knowledge, right?
Exactly. And last, you'd look at magician codes. This is where you envision solutions, crafting a narrative to inspire and get others on board.
I love how it goes beyond just, here's the problem and gets into crafting a story for change,
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Exactly. Now, moving on to the emergent story space, those exercises are all about experimentation, pushing those boundaries.
Give me an example. How would an exercise tap into that kind of emergent story space mindset?
Okay, so imagine you're exploring new materials and techniques for, I don't know, food production, right? Maybe you start by identifying these explorer codes, the taboos, those unexplored areas in that field. Could be something like lab-grown meat or, using bugs as a sustainable protein, things like that.
Pushing the limits, looking for those unconventional solutions. What's next?
Then you'd activate those creator codes. How can you play around with those kind of out there ideas? Maybe you dig into new technologies, prototype different ingredients, or even experiment with different, culinary
Something
traditions.
about like getting your hands dirty and seeing what's possible, both literally and figuratively, right?
Exactly. And lastly, you focus on Jester codes, finding ways to bring in that playfulness, that humor to spark curiosity and encourage folks to experiment.
So each story space has these codes to
Yeah.
like guide that innovation process.
Yeah.
It's like a roadmap for creative problem solving almost.
You got it. And then the dominant story space exercises help you polish those ideas, making them attractive and, easy to grasp for people.
So if the emergent story space is about generating a bunch of ideas, the dominant story space is about making them stick around.
Exactly. Let's say you're working on a campaign for like a new sustainable food product. You'd start by figuring out those hero codes, highlighting the good stuff, positioning it as the solution. Yeah.
Oh, appealing to that desire for something better, making it heroic, right?
Right. Then you'd leverage those lover codes. This is where you build that emotional connection, maybe by, I don't know, highlighting the craftsmanship, the story behind the ingredients, things like that.
Making it relatable, making people want it. Yeah,
Yeah, and finally, you'd hit those innocent codes to make that message super clear for, a bigger audience.
that's awesome. You're taking those sometimes complicated ideas and making them make sense and seem appealing.
Yeah, exactly. It's about crafting that narrative that truly clicks with people. Then finally, we go to the residual story space, where things shift to that long-term sustainability and impact.
This is where the big vision meets the like nuts and bolts of making it happen.
Right. Say you're developing guidelines for community-supported agriculture.
Yeah.
You'd start by nailing down those caregiver codes. What needs to be in place to make sure it's accessible, affordable, and you've got that community buy-in. We're talking logistics, distribution, maybe even some educational resources.
Thinking about all those practical things, the behind the scenes stuff that makes it all work, right?
Yes. Next up, you've got your ruler codes, the policies and regulations that need to be there to support this new food system. Think tax breaks for local farmers or zoning laws that encourage urban farming, that kind of thing.
You're building that supreme structure, those ground rules, so to speak.
Yeah, and finally, you've got to tap into those everyman codes. How do you make this system feel, normal? This could be through clear communication, community outreach, really emphasizing those shared values.
It's like weaving this safety net that makes sure this new way of doing things not only survives, but like thrives, and everyone can be a part of it. Wow, this has been like eye-opening. Seeing how to approach innovation in this new light is not just coming up with something new, but getting that whole story, navigating those story spaces you talked about.
Harnessing the power of narrative, right, for strategic innovation.
It's like we got a sneak peek at the culture mapping workshop series, going through the core ideas, why narrative is key, and even seeing how those workshop exercises work.
Remember those four story spaces, disruptive, emergent, dominant, and residual? They're like the framework for how change happens and where to put your energy at each step.
Totally. Those story spaces and the codes within them, they're like tools for any innovator, right? Not just to analyze trends, but to make actual change happen.
Exactly. When you get these concepts, you can be really smart about where you position your ideas, your products, even your whole company within like the bigger story of culture.
So our listeners are getting ready for this workshop series. They got this new knowledge.
Yeah.
What's like one last thought to leave them with?
As you come across trends, innovations, new things, try to figure out where does it fit in those story spaces. Ask yourself, what's my role in this story? How can I use these frameworks to make a real positive impact?
It's that reminder that we're not just watching culture unfold. We shape it too. This deep dive into culture mapping, it's given everyone the tools and the insights to innovate better and smarter.